Hello, everyone. Welcome to Goucher Environmental Dialogues. I'm Dr. Jen DeRosa. I'm the director of our Environmental Sustainability and Management Master's Degree Program here at Goucher College. And if this is your first time joining us, Goucher Environmental Dialogues are our web-based speaker series, and we feature cultivated conversations with environmental, sustainability, and climate leaders and visionaries. And the series is hosted, as I mentioned, by Goucher College's Master of Environmental Sustainability and Management. When I'm done introducing our speaker for today, I'm going to include our link tree in the chat, so you can then use that to access a link to register for future sessions, because we have a couple of new sessions coming up in the fall. You can watch past environmental dialogues on our YouTube channel. You can follow our adventures on social media, and you can also email me directly if you have any specific questions about our master's degree program or research opportunities at Goucher College. Now, for our conversation today, it's quite timely. It's a conversation about armed conflict and the environment. And here with me today is environmental attorney Elizabeth Hessami. So Elizabeth is, as I mentioned, an environmental attorney. She also serves as a faculty lecturer at Johns Hopkins University, where she teaches great classes in environmental security, public lands, private interests, and international environmental policy and law. Liz's primary area of research has been the impact of armed conflict on the environment, with a particular focus on Afghanistan and Ukraine. And she's a member of the Washington, D.C. and the U.S. Supreme Court bars, and co-chair of the Law Interest Group for the Environmental Peace Association. I had the pleasure of seeing her there at the Environmental Peace Building Conference last June. She also serves as a consultant on Afghanistan and Ukraine, natural resources and armed conflict, peace treaties, and peace building. And Liz was appointed in 2019 to serve on the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. So it's, again, a pleasure to welcome Liz today for our conversation. And just a reminder, kind of the format of our webinars. If you're an audience member, you can't turn on your mic or your camera. You're really just listening in. However, what you can do if you have any questions for our speaker is use the Q&A feature or the chat feature to pose a question. And I will try to give voice to some of these questions as we get towards the second half of our conversation. But with that being said, feel free to use the chat to also welcome our speaker, Elizabeth Hessami, and let us know where you're joining from today. We always appreciate that. Hello, Liz. So I'm so excited to be interviewing you today. So your work sits at the intersection of law, security, and environmental studies, fields that don't always talk to each other. So I'd love to first just start with asking you what drew you to environmental security specifically, and how did armed conflict become the through line of your research?
Thank you so much, Dr. DeRosa. Can everybody hear me okay? I hope so. I would like to take all of you back to when I was in high school, and I had the great chance to join a travel trip when I was studying Russian history and language that took us all over the Soviet Union. It took us down through Uzbekistan, almost to the border of Afghanistan, when there was active armed conflict happening right over the border, which was, pretty daring of them to do at the time. I don't think probably any school would do that now. But I did get a chance to go there and kind of bear witness to some of the trucks, the Soviet trucks coming out of Afghanistan, and hear the stories from people about what was happening inside Afghanistan. The use of all different types of horrific weapons, the impact on the environment. It made a huge impression on me, and that started my interest right there. Then I ended up going to law school, specializing in environmental law, and then eventually finding a home in the armed conflict and the environment. I've worked under the kind of tutelage of Carl Brook for many years. He's kind of the father of this field. He's written about 12 books on the topic or edited them. And so, but it really started there. And, it's, I think, an incredibly timely topic. And, but my kind of special areas of interest that I've actually actively consulted on are the situation in Afghanistan and in Ukraine. So that's what I would be more comfortable speaking to. And there's plenty to talk about there for sure. So thanks, Jen, for having me. Sorry, Dr. DeRosa, apologies. I actually have worked under Dr. DeRosa for many years when she was at Hopkins. So it's just a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, you can call me Jen. We're on.
Oh, sorry, I slipped up.
That's okay. No, I appreciate your background and how you came to this, because a lot of our students at Goucher College study abroad. Many, for the undergrads it's required, and for the graduate students it's optional. And I think that speaks to the impact and how that can kind of change your career trajectory by something that you witnessed and studying in another place. So I love that. My next question for you is maybe going a little bit deeper. When most people picture the costs of war, they'll often think of human casualties and destroyed infrastructure, but not necessarily ecosystems. So what kinds of environmental damage tend to get overlooked, just for a lot of our audience who's kind of new to thinking about this? And also, why does that invisibility matter legally and practically?
Well, it's critical, particularly when you are trying to prove damages, and you need evidence clearly. And in the past, I can tell you with Afghanistan, for example, when the Soviet military first went into Afghanistan in about 1980, they just obliterated many areas of the nation. They targeted water systems, infrastructure. They used every kind of weapon they had. They killed almost 2 million people in the first year. But nobody really knew this. It was because it's so remote in Afghanistan. And at the time, there wasn't sort of the ability to catalog this that we have nowadays today. So the conflict in Ukraine, which began about 4 years ago, has been very, very well documented. The use of all sorts of different weapons. My interest is particularly in landmines and the damage they cause, and chemical weapons as well. Landmines, it's very difficult because the leaching of chemicals like TNT and RDX into the soil can take years, and it's hard to verify, and it's somewhat invisible. And so, and also the use of chemical warfare, chemical weapons in Afghanistan. I remember doing some research and combing through declassified CIA documents and reading villager accounts of what really looked like was Agent Orange being used, or some sort of similar defoliant that we've all kind of heard about in terms of Vietnam. But many chemical weapons were used in Afghanistan and are still being used in current conflicts, unfortunately. And so, but it's critical to prove damage in a court. And this is kind of a very new field of law, trying to hold nations accountable when they do this kind of thing. And so if anyone here is interested in this topic, there is an absolutely excellent website called the Conflict and Environment Observatory that does very specific research on documenting environmental crimes. And so if you have a specific conflict that you're interested in seeing what's going on with that, like Sudan or Ukraine or many of the other armed conflicts currently happening, you can go to the Conflict and Environment Observatory and then and see what's logged on there. So it's very important. For example, I have some specific numbers here. Ukraine's already compiled a database of over 10,000 eco-crimes, estimating the environmental damages of war currently at about $150 billion. So these are not, and this is really new that we're able to kind of in real time document this. And so I'm very excited about that, because it was heartbreaking to witness what was happening in Afghanistan. And really the rest of the world, I knew a little bit about it. Maybe they saw some video on their evening news, but that was really it. So it's very organized now. You can document this.
I appreciate that. And just to kind of dig in a little bit more to some of what you just said. So imagine like the damages against water or even energy infrastructure, when they're collecting proof of this, evidence of this. Is that something that legally you have to wait until after the conflict is over to try and have like reparations and amends, or is that something that is trying to be rectified even in the middle of the armed conflict? I'm just curious.
I think right now, Ukraine is still in the gathering phase of evidence. And,
Okay.
whether and how, I mean, I have to be careful what I say because I have consulted on this directly. So whether there will be actual, money damages awarded is something that I can't speak to, but for sure right now, the evidence is being amassed, let's say.
Okay, I appreciate that. And when I send out the recording of this tomorrow, probably, I'll also make sure I include a link to the Conflict and Environmental Observatory that you mentioned, so people can check out that web resource. So Afghanistan and Ukraine, if my memory serves me correct, they're quite different conflicts, and they're taking place in quite different settings and contexts. What has comparing them taught you about how war reshapes the landscape? And are there lessons that transfer from one to another, even though they're so different?
Yeah, I think in both cases, what's been my focus has been the targeting of water infrastructure and how that not only terrorizes populations. The Taliban certainly targeted dams in Afghanistan before they took power. But in Ukraine, we've seen how the Kakhovka, I can't pronounce it very well, Kakhovka Dam was destroyed, and it absolutely decimated a lot of agricultural fields and damage went far past that, released a lot of different sort of chemicals and that were in the ground. And so I think for me, the impact of the targeting of water infrastructure has to be outlawed completely under international law in a better manner than it is right now. So that's just one of my observations.
Oh, that's interesting to think about, and different contexts too. I'm thinking that Afghanistan being arid is like really, really water sensitive in terms of water.
Yeah.
And then you need water to grow food. I'm thinking that that's also tied to their GDP and industry and so that's quite fascinating.
And if I can just add something, Jen.
Oh yeah.
Ukraine before the conflict was really the breadbasket of many areas of the world that were already facing severe hardships. And so when you start targeting dams and then destroying agricultural fields, targeting grain silos, this has, just domino effects all over the world. For the most, like Yemen, that was dependent on Ukrainian grain and things like that, that has just a domino effect on some of the most vulnerable populations on Earth. So it's particularly horrifying. And you're absolutely right. In an arid nation like Afghanistan, where people struggle to meet their, to get any kind of quality water supply as it is, if you're targeting, let's say, the major source of water, what are people supposed to do? It's an incredibly terrible tactic to use.
I have another question for you. I have a lot of questions. And then also a reminder too, as you're listening to this, if you think of a question that you'd like me to ask Liz later on, please use our chat and go ahead and give voice to that, and I will try to get to them. One question is, so international law has instruments that are meant to shield the environment in wartime, but enforcement seems like it would be very, very difficult. Where do you see the biggest gap between what the law says and what actually happens on the ground, and what would help close that gap?
Well, I do want to say, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, that really documentation is critical, because you can draft all the laws you want, but if you can't prove that something happened, then it's almost impossible to get any kind of enforcement or reparation of what's happening. And one of the biggest problems that's happened over the past few years has been disinformation campaigns coming out. And now that AI is being used, it's even worse. But I can think of one particular conflict a few years ago that I was asked to write an article on that for a major publication. So I went to CEOPS, and this was early in the conflict, and this was in the Caucasus region. I don't want to get too specific, but and they could not verify what was being accused. Both sides were accusing each other of using white phosphorus on forests, which is, horrific. If anyone knows anything about white phosphorus, one of the most horrific substances that should be banned internationally, but because of semantics, it's still used. It really shouldn't be. But anyhow, I couldn't verify what was happening, and so I felt very uncomfortable writing about it. So if just me, a little professor, can't figure, out, or lecturer can't figure out what's going on, and I feel uncomfortable writing about it, then how is it possible to hold anyone accountable? That's where COPS comes in again, because if you have teams of people who are willing to go and find out what's happening and document, then from a trusted organization, that can make all the difference in enforcement, in what's happening. So that, and then of course, unfortunately, when you have nations that ban, any organization or journalist from entering, then you have a real problem, because then, the last frontier is citizens just holding up their iPhones, and that is happening in certain places around the world.
And that seems very complicated to try and sift through. Can you clarify? So when you mentioned COPS, do you mean just citizens on the ground?
Conflict and Environment Observatory. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
CEOBS. Yeah, that's just the.
Okay.
Sorry, COPS is the Conflict Environment Observatory, but
okay,
it's
that's
just
the acronym for it. Okay.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And even if you have to use citizens on the ground recording things with their phones, I imagine that too is hard to verify in today's era of AI doctored stuff.
Yeah.
So, gosh, that's got to be really tricky.
And also, especially in the conflict I was thinking about, when you have outside nations who have interests in one side or the other, who have the ability to doctor video, or even sometimes they used. I talked to someone at the Conflict Environment Observatory. There were videos being released, but those were like old, just movies. And so, it's very, very hard. Yeah, it's very complicated.
Oh, that's wild. So I want to also pivot to mention your work with the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. So you're the co-chair of the Law Interest Group for Environmental Peacebuilding Association. And again, I encourage everyone to take a look at the organization. They do some fascinating work. You work on the idea that environmental cooperation can be a pathway to peace rather than a casualty of war. Can you share an example of where maybe that's played out, and what makes an environmental issue useful as a common ground between adversaries or opposing groups?
Absolutely, Jen, Dr. DeRosa. When I was consulting in Afghanistan, I talked to one of the global experts on the conflict there. This is not a long time ago, but it's, let's say, 2021, before the government fell. So I was consulting for the European Institute of Peace. They were hoping there was going to be a peace treaty between the Afghan government and the Taliban. So they were preparing some documents on natural resources if there was a peace treaty. So anyhow, I was talking to an expert, and he told me sometimes when you're working between two highly adversarial groups, the only thing you can talk about is sports or planting trees. And sometimes it's just planting trees. And so that's where environmental peace building comes into, because most of the time, not always, people care about the environment they leave to their children, regardless of what group they're in. And so that just hit home to me exactly what environmental peace building is. And if you want to really define it, because a lot of people are like, what does that mean? So environmental peace building is an approach that connects the environment and peace using shared management of natural resources, water, forests, planting trees, land, to prevent fights, to reduce tensions, and heal communities after a war. And one thing that's interesting is even sometimes the most belligerent groups will have environmental policies, or they'll want people to plant trees because it benefits them. But one of the best things I've seen, I love, are the small projects that kind of unite youth groups from very opposing groups. I'm thinking of Cyprus, which is one of my favorite countries in the world, a beautiful island, and was torn apart in '74 when there was a war there. And so a lot of animosity between certain groups. It's gotten better, I think, especially amongst younger generations, but they come together in Cyprus for beach cleanups and things, and like beach cleanups specifically. There is a shared waste management facility in Nicosia. And so these projects have really been successful. And I think that there's a lot of hope when you come together, like for a sea turtle habitat, things like that that people love, or planting trees for a forest that, you know, perhaps they know that, yeah, that forest is not going to probably come into full fruition for a long time, but it still brings people a lot of hope. So
I like the examples you're giving too, and it's making me think as well of other examples I've heard of historically. I think if I'm remembering correctly, even like in South Africa, the use of sports to kind of bring people together. I mean, if anyone's watching the World Cup, obviously there's a big match on later today.
Yep.
And then also with the tree planting, I've been doing a lot of reading about Kenya's history because I'm going to be bringing Goucher students to Kenya next year. And the whole Greenbelt movement through the 80s and 90s was all about planting trees and bringing people together. So I sometimes think that we uh, maybe at home locally we take that for granted, but realizing that something as simple as that can be a unifying activity that really doesn't know a party or a side, but it can bring people together. I think that's a really creative way of thinking of that. Can you also talk a bit about the PURAC principles? And for clarity, for anyone listening, that PURAC stands for Protection of the Environment in Relation to Armed Conflict. So what are these principles? What do they achieve? How did they come about?
Absolutely. Before I start talking about PARAC, because it's very, very exciting, because I have a little tiny role in that. So I love to talk about PARAC. But I just wanted to tell you, Dr. DeRosa, that one really exciting program that I saw presented at the conference one day was that the Kenyan military is actually using their soldiers to plant trees. It's a whole project, and it's very cool. And I think it's the Kenyan Defense Force that's involved in planting trees. So one of the presenters at the Environmental Peacebuilding Conference had gone to Kenya and interviewed the soldiers about how they felt about this. You know, were they like, you know, how did they feel? And there were different, you know, levels of commitment. You know, some of them were compliant because they had to do it, and some of them were really committed. Like, this is so important, and we see how this restores dignity and brings, you know, so many different factors that our society needs just through the trees. So that was really exciting. But over to the PARAC principles, again, protection of the environment in relation to armed conflict. So the in relation is important because when you talk about protection of the environment and war, generally speaking, in the past, it's always been about what's happening during wartime, during active armed conflict. But there's a whole conflict cycle that's before, during, and after armed conflict. So PARAC kind of brings together different pieces of law from around the legal sphere, so to speak, and puts them in one codified document that was passed by the General Assembly in 2022. So, and if people don't realize this, if something's passed by the General Assembly, generally speaking, it can be considered customary law. So that's important if there is a trial going on or something like that. But that was very exciting because my mentor, Carl Brook, was really deeply involved in their development. And it started with, and if anyone's interested in policy development, this is a clear example, because in 2009, Carl worked with UNEP on a report protecting the environment during armed conflict, just kind of a basic report, and you can Google that, it's available online. Now, out of that, the UN International Law Commission decided, we really need more guidance on protecting the environment. And a lot of different aspects to protecting the environment. Protecting the environment of indigenous peoples during conflict. Not targeting areas of great environmental or cultural importance is another principle. That played out a few years ago when a certain very, very important cultural city in Iran was threatened. And luckily that didn't happen, but so that, would have been very much against the PARAC principles. But also it speaks to businesses that want to do business in a conflict impacted state that's very fragile, and kind of the responsibility that they may have by doing that. So they speak to a lot of different kind of points. Now they're not perfect. There's still some gaps in there. They don't account for certain things that maybe they should. So law is always developing. I think that's one thing I want to stress. It's a process. Everything's not perfect right now, and it can't be, because it is a progression. If you think of international environmental law policy, in 1900, we had just a few, like maybe a few treaties on, wildlife stocks that were strictly to ensure economic viability of the stocks. And now we have over 1,000 treaties. But that doesn't mean that these treaties are actively monitored or enforced, or that they're able to be. So it is a progression. It's sort of like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But the PARIC principles at least bring things together into one document that has been passed by the General Assembly and has widespread agreement across the world that these are very important principles. And now it's sort of operationalizing the PARIC principles that I think organizations like the Environmental Law Institute are interested in.
That's great to hear. I mean, I remember I've talked to you previously about the PARIC principles, and I find it quite fascinating as an example of like a foundational like structure to follow.
Right.
And I think your reminder too is great for anyone interested in policy in general, that policy very much evolves. It's never,
Yes.
Nothing's perfect. It's always a work in progress, but it's always getting better over time. You actually mentioned something that that got me thinking when you mentioned also the protection of cultural sites and heritage sites. Maybe the PARIC principles are not like as specific, but I'm curious, does that kind of entail like if a city or a place is kind of like a UNESCO heritage site, then it would be kind of given those broader protections, or are we also maybe talking public lands, or is it maybe not that granular in the actual principles? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's very vague. I mean, at this point, it sort of just states areas of great environmental or cultural significance, how that will play out as we go forward. But I think there are certain places like UNESCO World Heritage Sites that I think would be indisputably under that umbrella, in my opinion. But, how other nations will feel. However, how these things happen in the real world is very different. For example, there are many wetlands in Ukraine that are Ramsar protected. Now, Ramsar is a fabulous convention that protects wetlands and waterfowl, migrating waterfowl. So, but unfortunately, those wetlands have been destroyed during this war, many of them. So, what happens in reality during wartime and what we set out to protect, it's again, that's a process. But it's a start. Let's put it that way. To start.
Yeah, I think it is a start. It's also drawing the international community's attention to environmental, the different elements of the environment that can be damaged, whereas somebody may not realize, like, oh, if we blow that up, it's going to harm the soil for the next 50 years. Right. So like those long-term impacts, I think it starts with awareness and then also being proactive and having a plan. So this is very good to hear, because so often people get very concerned about the state of the world, but it's good to hear that this is a space that's actively being worked on. I know Professor Torres posted a question in the chat, so I'm going to give voice to that. One of his questions kind of goes back to your mention of Agent Orange. He asks, are there U.S. domestic laws on the continued production and use of Agent Orange and Agent Blue that you're aware of? And are there international treaties on the production and use of chemicals like these? Not sure if you can speak to that or not. Are you aware of that?
Yeah, I believe Agent Orange for sure is not produced anymore. However, at least in this country, as far as I know, and I'm just trying to see keeping the government accountable. Well, that's that's a very, very difficult thing, because obviously the fight to hold the U.S. accountable for our use of Agent Orange in Vietnam has not really progressed. There have been a few, I believe, projects, but and decisions, but I don't know that it's gone as far as it should. So, but specifics on that, yeah, I don't think so. I think that the problem can be in the wording, because something like white phosphorus can be labeled as being, okay, it can only be used for illumination. Okay, well, sure, that's fine. But if you're deploying it during wartime for illuminating things and it's killing everybody in its path, then, that's, in my opinion, that's using international law to kind of allow things that shouldn't be allowed.
Kind of a twisting or misinterpretation of things.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. That makes sense. I do have a final question for you, but I'm gonna wait for a second and just remind everyone that if they have a question for Elizabeth, to feel free to post that in either the Q&A or the chat. We had another question in the Q&A section, because you'd spoken about disinformation, but this is a kind of compelling. In what ways is greenwashing used or weaponized maybe during armed conflicts? And for clarification, I guess for our audience, greenwashing is generally when an action, a product, a behavior is kind of posed or sort of broadcasted as being good for the environment and great for the environment, when maybe there aren't necessarily science to support that. Are you aware of any cases of greenwashing being used in situations where there's conflict?
That's a great question. I haven't really thought about that too much, but I know it sort of upsets me a little bit when I hear about certain governments saying, oh, this method of warfare is not as, damaging to climate as this one. I mean, you're still killing people, so I think we have to be very careful. But that's not really, I haven't gotten into that too much.
I like how you worded that, because it's sort of like using sustainable warfare, which is
right,
like, well,
exactly.
Doesn't that defeat the whole goal of sustainability,
right,
which is not to hurt people and harm the landscape?
Exactly.
So it seems a bit of an oxymoron to use that kind of a phrasing. And if while our audiences continue to think of possible questions, I'll ask my last question for you, because I always like to kind of circle back. We have a lot of graduate students at Goucher that you may be doing what their dream role is, for example, or just students in general. So for students, practitioners that are just listening in, concerned citizens that might be joining us today, many of whom want to contribute to this work, where do you see the environmental peace building field heading, and what gives you hope about the future?
Much, Jen, because Dr. Dorothy,
Okay.
because it is such a young field, and I am older, obviously, but than probably most of the people here. But I do remember about 15 years ago being on a call with my mentor, Carl Brook, and one of the heads of UNEP, which is United Nations Environment Program, and they were actually defining the term environmental peace building. It was that the field is that new. So it's so new that it's wide open for, I think, younger people to get involved, go to the Environmental Peace Building Association website, see if there's something interesting maybe you'd like to research or study. And so I think the field's wide open. Peace and justice, there's several universities that have graduate degrees in peace and justice. And if you combine that with maybe an undergrad degree in something environmental, I can see that being really interesting. And but I do think this is a very interesting field that we really need a lot of younger people involved in it. And again, it's just getting started. This was only our 4th conference this year. So, this is very, very new stuff, but I'm really excited for it. Yeah.
I like your recommendations for younger folks to get involved. It struck me at the conference in June that they had in Canada for environmental peace building. there were so many different types of practitioners there, not just researchers and academics, but folks that were lawyers, folks that were working for NGOs, folks that I think I attended a session on a technology expert that was tracking deforestation in some part of the world. And so it was really, some of them were even associated with media and reporting and communicating. So it was really fascinating to see all these different people from different backgrounds working for a common good, and it was very inspiring. So I'll make sure when I send out the recording tomorrow that I'll also send out a link to their website. I'm seeing that we do have another question. Tim asks, can you address the environmental impacts of military test ranges and bases that are not active conflict zones? I don't know if you're able to speak to that or not, but maybe military testing that supports military preparedness. Are you able to speak to that?
Okay, I can and I can't. I don't obviously study that, but I can tell you I have very personal experience with that because there is a test bombing range near my home here in Florida. And so I know how disruptive that is. It does shake my house every so often. And obviously that's a necessary thing militaries have to do. But that's a great question. And all I can say is I've experienced the repercussions of that in my own home, and how kind of terrifying it is. And I can't even imagine if I was in another nation and a foreign nation was doing that. I don't know. That's my only take on that, is just hearing my windows literally shake every so often.
I can appreciate that as a child of an Air Force test pilot who lived on a lot of Air Force bases growing up. And I also, as a former civilian for the Navy, I realize there's a necessity of being ready, in terms of military preparedness and safety. But I think as the science of environmental science has progressed and matured in the last few decades, but also as it seems like policy is also maturing, I would guessing at this point that a lot of the environmental testing that took place like in the 1960s and 70s and 80s is not necessarily happening today in the same way because of more environmental protections. But that's my gut and not necessarily backed up. But I would encourage folks, if they're interested in this topic, to definitely dig in. Well, since I don't see any more questions posed, I want to thank you, Liz, for your time. Really appreciate this conversation. Also thank our audience members for joining. And if you can give maybe virtual thanks for Liz in the chat, that would always be appreciated. And I will follow up tomorrow with the recording. And thank you, everyone. Again, pleasure to have you.
Thanks all. Appreciate it.